There is an ancient Japanese legend of a village on the sea attacked by fierce warriors. And so a hero rose from the bamboo forests to protect the villagers. This hero was not a man, but a droid built from the ancient technology. However, this droid was built by gamey builds, so he was weak and immediately destroyed. End of legend.
The first piece I built of this ancient bucket of bolts was the head, which I carved out of an eraser after plotting out the approximate shape with a pen. I also added some pieces of 0.5mm thin styrene for some detail and dimension. This stuff was purchased recently from eBay, and due to some devious product photography, I thought I was getting a lot more for my money. For the robot's necking, I used my tried and true method of whoa, not that kind of robot necking. As I was saying, I used my old method of winding a piece of wire with thin electrical wire to make a cable-like thing. The innards from an LED light bulb made for more neck bits, which I then assembled with superglue. The torso is a leftover part from the Ailstrike Gundam I used for my Jeff build, though I can't for the life of me remember what exactly it was. Then I drilled holes for those rods and glued. Some other tiny detailing can be seen here with odds and ends from my bits box. The black pieces are from a disassembled lighter, and the white thingy is also from the LED bulb. Once the head and torso were attached, I reused the technique from Jeff's back spine thing to make a little canister to give the droid a little more interest in his cranial area. And yet more Gundam parts for the arms of the droid. Another thing I learned from my Jeff robot build was to be sure to attach the arms a lot better to the body, which is why I've opted here to have this rod that goes through the entire torso and then connects to the arms. You'd think this would be common sense from the get-go, but not with me. This grasshopper must fail many times to learn even the most rudimentary of techniques. I also decided to revisit guitar string, a material I've avoided since my pod racer because I found it difficult to shape accurately. It's a lot more cooperative here, likely because I've kept the shape simple. To bulk up the arms, I'm adding Q-tips. When doing scratch builds, my goal is to add interesting shapes and textures which will hopefully all come together to form a cohesive whole once finished. Not bad for a legless horseman. And as for the horse, I realized at this point that I had no idea what a samurai-era Japanese saddle looked like, so I googled it, then got to sculpting it with Sculpey air dry clay. I pressed out a flat piece that fit the general size of the saddle, then carved away with an X-Acto blade. I love the intricate artistry in the designs I saw online, and I utterly failed to emulate them here. Once the clay dried, I sanded it down lightly, and then used my Dremel to sand off some of the unwanted details on the horse itself. I then added the top of the saddle with a simple blob of this air dry clay. Now onto the bridle. I'm using thick poster paper here, but first crumpling it for a bit of extra leathery texture. I then cut it into thin strips and superglued it piece by piece onto the horse. For the horse's tiny bit ring, I wound this thin copper wire around a rigid piece of thicker wire and snipped, then inserted it into the paper bridle. More paper was used for the saddle strap and reins. Now onto the thighs, for which I'll once again scavenge among the Gundam graveyard. The hips, on the other hand, came from a Star Wars toy I bought a while back for a pre-YouTube scratch model. I drilled holes for the leg sockets and then screwed it all together. I considered adding my thumb to the build, which is I guess why I drilled a hole into it too. More Gundam pieces for the calves. And to unify these a bit with the top half of the droid, more Q-tips for detail. And yet more detail with these Gundam trimmings from the appendages. And for the feet, I'm using these little plastic toy bits. If you're thinking of getting into scratch modeling robots and sci-fi stuff, I'd highly recommend going to your nearest thrift store and checking out the toy section. They'll often have little baggies of action figures and accessories. An added bonus is that you can stand around for long stretches of time in deep concentration as you stare at broken Barbies and have everyone wondering about your mental stability. And then it was time to get hands-on with these Gundam hands. After removing the unnecessary bits, I added some beads as cufflinks, and quite literally so, as they connect the hands to the forearms, which in this case were the barest of bones, Q-tips once again, for consistency. To assure myself that the position of the hands was correct, I sat my droid in his saddle and threaded the reins through the hands to see what would look good. And with my anxiety about the outcome slightly assuaged, I decided I wanted the droid to be carrying something on its back. I opted for a backpack constructed from bamboo, constructed from these toothpicks. Once superglued, I cut and repeated the process piece by piece until I had something that roughly resembled an ancient bamboo backpack. To make the backpack actually serve a purpose, I built the following things out of clay. This package, a rolled mat, and a weird thing made with a Gundam headpiece. But then I realized it looked like an amputated torso, so I changed some stuff around and added another package. And I don't know what that Gundam head is, if you're wondering. Maybe it's a container for someone's ashes. To overcomplicate my life, I decided to push the Japanese aesthetic a bit further with plated armor, which I made from this thick aluminum foil. After adding each section of armor, I made tiny rivets with a dab of superglue. And finally, for the droid's grass hat, I tried this previously seen method of making an even line around a round object, although I'm stupid and this is a ball so it didn't work. But there's a tool for this. This is a hobby saw and a miter box, and I still struggled, but eventually managed this. To make the hat more sturdy, I added air dry clay to the inside. Once dry, I slightly unwound bits of twine and glued them piece by piece onto the cut ping pong ball. As for the base, I'm back to my old go-to of hardback novel covers. I sandwiched a piece of foam core between the top and bottom for thickness, then glued. Finally, a thinner strip of 1mm chipboard was added for the edges. I then traced out what would become a dirt path between the bamboo for my horse and droid to travel along, then cut out some bits of foam core for some elevation on either side of the path. Once glued, I carved away at the edges for a smooth slope, then sanded. I then coated my forest floor in a mix of brown paint, Mod Podge, and sand, but the end result was hideous and I hated it, so I opted for a different method here. This is cheap, super thin cork material with sticky backing purchased at my local dollar store. It gave the ground cover a much more visually interesting look, especially after I applied several layers of browns and then added a nice wash. The wash here is homemade and very simple, black acrylic mixed with lots of water. Finally, a bit of dry brushed khaki helped the colors to pop a bit. To add some life to this rectangle of desolation, I added some watered down white glue into the cracks and then sprinkled on a bit of flocking. I know, it makes zero sense that this forest ground is so dry that the dirt ground is cracking and yet moist enough that life is teeming in those cracks. It's because the forest is mysterious, okay? And behold my mighty bamboo. To turn these pen shells into a thicket, I first washed and sanded them, then added thin rings around the stalks using polymer clay. Of course, the problem with polymer clay is that it needs to be baked in an oven to harden, an environment that these cheap markers weren't designed for. I should have thought of this earlier, but again, I'm dumb. Although my accidental creation was so bizarre and captivating that I considered stopping right here and calling it art. This is my latest creation. I call it Je suis un idiot. But fortunately, while some of the lower caliber plastics were totally ruined, most of the bamboo stalks were only slightly warped, which actually ended up working to make them look more like bamboo. But of course, first they needed a nice coat of dark green. Once the paint dried, I glued the markers end to end with hot glue. I also gave them just a bit of scoliosis at their seams for a more natural look. I realized at this point that the hot glue made for some pretty convincing bamboo ringlet seam things, so I went back and added a bunch more of those to all of the bamboo stalks, since the rings seemed to be too far apart anyway. Of course, all of this meant that now I had to repaint this bamboo again because I didn't think to assemble the bamboo before painting. And why?
You're so dumb. You are really dumb. For real.
And apparently one of the job requirements over at the spray paint company is being a rotten liar, because I specifically purchased matte, and on a scale of gloss 1 to 10, I would put this at a Dr. Phil's head. To cover up some of that sheen, I brushed on some dark green, but it looked a little mean, so I added yellow to let it mellow. Yo. For the bamboo leaves, I knew I was going to use paper, but it turns out that my local craft store doesn't sell paper in the bamboo leaf texture variety, so I had to make my own by painting vertical stripes of greens on this mint-colored sheet of printer paper. After both sides were coated in leafy green, I set out to give myself an aneurysm. Good job, me. 1 down, 1 trillion to go. I hear at Guantanamo Bay they've stopped waterboarding and just make the inmates do this. Still, as I went, it did speed up a little, especially when I started using time-lapse photography. But of course, forests aren't just home to living things, but dead leaves as well, so I literally repeated that last maddening step all over again for my diorama's forest floor of bamboo death confetti. By the way, it's a good time to thank you all for your kind comments of support on my previous 4 builds and videos. I appreciate the subscriptions, likes, and shares, and please don't hesitate to point out in your comments things you would have done differently. The little voice in my head constantly nitpicking my methods could always use company. This next idea was from my wife. Upon wandering into my work area and seeing me staring blankly at a pile of cut leaves, she suggested that I use masking tape for the branches. This idea is totally awesome, and I would have never thought of it, so thanks, babe. She also helped me cut a bunch more leaves out when I realized I didn't have enough and was wallowing in a puddle of my own tears. Once the branches were painted, it was just a matter of attaching each leaf piece by piece. It was very easy and painless, and I didn't struggle at all with the super glue sticking to everything except the stems. And no, it totally didn't take me a day to realize that it was much easier to simply dip the ends of the leaves into white glue and then press the glued ends onto the branches. To mount the bamboo, I first marked out some spots on my forest floor, then drilled. Then from the bottom of the base I added these screws. To attach the bamboo to the screws, I added a generous dollop of hot glue and inserted. And if you follow me on Instagram, you've probably already seen this little time lapse. With the hot glue dry and solid, I then superglued on the leaves and branches. I now got to painting the backpack green. You may have noticed that I have access to green toothpicks, so you might be wondering, hey, why doesn't this guy just use those toothpicks and save himself some work? To which I say,
I wish you'd get out of my life and shut up.
And here's me painting the stuff that'll go in the backpack. For a finishing touch, I wrapped a tiny bit of twine around the items in the pack to hold them in place. By the way, I lost that Gundam helmet thing, but I'm sure I'll find it later, probably when it launches a surprise attack on my vacuum cleaner. Now on to the fun part, priming and painting the horse and ancient droid. I first airbrushed on a coat of black. The reason I'm not using spray paint for this is that I find spray paint goes on much too thick, which leads to a loss of details. I then dry brushed a bit of brown onto my steed, then touched up the hair with black. For the eyes, I'm adding a bit of glossy Mod Podge for that eyeball sheen. I also painted the saddle red with gold accents, but you'll see why that was a mistake in a moment. For the droid, I airbrushed on a base coat of dark red, then built up layers of lighter reds. For the edges of much of the droid, I added this silver paint. I paint here because these are the bits where paint would chip and wear away naturally. I also wanted my droid to have a bit of gold, as I noticed a lot of gold and red color designs when it came to ancient Japanese stuff. And remember how I mentioned that painting the saddle red and gold was a mistake? Well, yeah, that becomes pretty apparent here when you realize you can't distinguish between the droid's legs and the thing he's sitting on. So I repainted the saddle boring black and cried a little. The droid was also too dark, as I really wanted that red from its body to pop against the green of the bamboo. So I added a more vibrant red, covering up most of the silver and gold and necessitating this repaint.
You're so dumb. You are really dumb. For real.
This looked a lot better, so I glued it in place and added the reins. Off camera, I had also drilled holes into the horse's hooves so that I could insert this wire. The other end was inserted into these pre-drilled holes in the base, and that was that. Well, as usual, this was a fun little project that ended up being way more than I bargained for, thanks to those handmade leaves and branches. But the end result is something I'm not totally ashamed of having on my shelf, so there's that. As always, a big thanks to those of you who are willing to watch a guy fumble his way through Scratch modeling projects. I truly appreciate it. So, until next time, this is Gamey Builds, over and out.